Thinking aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to be examining philosophy and psychotherapy. We'll be looking at how our behavior, our emotions are affected by our ideas. With me is Dr. Ellis, one of the most influential psychologists in the history of psychology. Dr. Ellis is the author of over 60 books and 600 academic papers. He originally began his career as a sexologist, and as the author of books such as The Art and Science of Love and Sex Without Guilt, is considered one of the fathers of the sexual revolution of the 1960s. In addition, he is considered the grandfather of cognitive behavior therapy, perhaps the most influential psychotherapeutic movement today, and the founder of rational emotive therapy. Welcome, Dr. Ellis.
Good to be here, Jeff.
It's a pleasure to be with you. You are probably most widely noted for introducing into the field of psychotherapy an idea that seems almost self-evident, which is that our behavior, our being, ourselves, are affected by our philosophies, by what we think.
Right. And also, conversely, I introduced many years ago when I first formed RET, Rational Emotive Therapy, the idea that our thinking is also affected by our behavior and our feelings.
Mm-hmm. So in effect, it's all one system.
That's right. Interactional.
Mm-hmm. And that system can therefore obviously be affected by dealing with any part of it, I would assume, behavior, emotions, or cognition or thoughts.
Right, but profoundly, if you profoundly change your philosophy, your thinking, then you're more likely, in all probability, to profoundly change your feeling and your behavior, and especially your disturbed feeling and your disturbed behavior.
And you drew on the ancient philosophers and sort of coming to the notion that philosophy itself could be a form of psychotherapy. At that point, you broke away from psychoanalysis and developed a form of cognitive therapy.
Yes, I practiced and was a psychoanalyst for a while, but then I discovered that it didn't work, and I have a gene for efficiency, while poor Sigmund Freud had a gene for inefficiency. So I went back to my hobby since the age of 16, philosophy, the philosophy of the ancients, largely of Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, and in the East of Confucius and Lao Tse and Buddha, and amalgamated it with behavior therapy, which I had used on myself at the age of 19 to get myself over my phobia of public speaking and of approaching young females.
Mm-hmm. Well, if I could get to the kernel of your thought, it is basically that whatever happens to us in life, it's not totally responsible for our emotions.
Right. It's partly, it contributes to it. A, activating events contribute to C, consequences in our gut, but it's B, our belief system, our philosophy, which mainly, largely, or certainly in great part, makes us feel and think the way we do, especially think and, I should say, behave the way we do, especially in a disturbed manner. We disturb ourselves.
And typically, I suppose, when a person is very angry or very depressed, they almost always think that it's something outside that's causing that.
Right. And we normally, and I think biologically, tend to think that because, see, consequences, my anger immediately follows you are treating me unfairly, that you made me angry instead of you made me feel sorry and regretful to some degree, but my anger I added by commanding and demanding that you not do what you indubitably did.
And in a sense, if I'm right, you broke with Freud in suggesting that the parents aren't responsible, early upbringing isn't responsible, that we teach ourselves these kinds of neurotic behaviors.
Right. We're born gullible to our parents, influenceable, teachable in the first place. Therefore, we stupidly listen to our parents, but then we invent many must, shoulds, ought, demands, commands, in addition to the standards, the values that we adopt from our parents. But the standards don't upset us. we mainly upset ourselves with those Jehovian commands.
Yeah. You've used the term, I think you must have coined it, masturbation.
Right, that masturbation is good and delicious, but masturbation is evil and pernicious, is one of my sayings.
And masturbation is when we tell ourselves, I must do this, or things must be this way, even though they're not.
Right, the three main musts are I must do well, or I'm no good. You louse, must treat me well, or you're worthless and deserve to roast in hell. And the world must give me exactly what I want, precisely when I want it, or it's a horrible, awful place.
It would be awful.
It would be terrible, right? Because of the must. If you didn't masturbate, then you wouldn't awfulize, terribilize, catastrophize, say, I can't stand it, and put yourself down. If you're only stuck with, I'd like very much to do well, but I never have to, then you wouldn't then disturb yourself.
Yeah. So the technique that you get engaged in with your clients is one of disputing their musts, their ideas, and showing them that logically, scientifically, philosophically, things are not that way, that nothing must be if it isn't.
The technique is a scientific method, and we say, and we're the only cognitive behavioral therapy which does say, that when you think anti-scientifically, devoutly, really piously, dogmatically, which is inflexible and anti-scientific, then you disturb yourself. Therefore, we use the flexible scientific method to get you philosophically and otherwise to undisturb yourself.
Now, many people, I think particularly the Freudian school of therapy, would suggest that simply being told by your therapist that you're thinking things wrong isn't going to make a bit of difference, that you'll continue with the same old behaviors anyway.
And we would agree that being told it or told where you got it, which you didn't get it from your sacred mother and father, won't help you. But the insight that I made myself disturbed, I foolishly listened to my mother and father and took them too seriously, and I'm still doing it, and that now I require work and practice to give up my biological and sociological tendency to disturb myself. That will help you, not the belief that I disturb myself and that I don't have to. That'll help, but not that much.
Yeah. Well, doesn't the idea that if you can simply change your philosophy, that your whole behavior will change, somehow go against, the behaviorist concept or the materialist notion that the mind doesn't really influence matter? In effect, you're saying that our mind will influence.
Very significantly, but we also say that since you worked at this foolish philosophy, ingrained it in yourself, conditioned yourself, that therefore it requires work and practice to give it up, and it requires feeling against it. So we always use cognitive thinking and emotive, dramatic, evocative, and behavioral techniques to get people comprehensively to change and to stay changed.
In effect, what you say is that every emotional state has its concomitant belief system.
Right. That even sorrow and regret, which would be appropriate emotions when you're not getting what you want, have the belief system, it's too bad, isn't it unfortunate, while horror and depression has it's awful, and it must not be this way, and I can't bear it. So, and each of the negative self-defeating states, such as depression or anxiety or despair or rage, has some individual difference in what you tell yourself, what you believe philosophically.
So, in a sense, the heart of your philosophical approach then is to distinguish between what we might call appropriate philosophies, appropriate emotions, and inappropriate ones.
And oddly enough, I discovered after years of doing rational emotive therapy, RET, that there only are a few differences, and one main difference, and it's crucial, is taking a preference, a desire, a goal, a value, practically all of which are legitimate, and escalating it again, transmuting it into a demand, a should, an ought, a must, an absolute.
In other words, the most terrible thing could happen to me. Perhaps I have leprosy,
Right.
or some kind of a fatal disease, or I think as you pointed out, maybe somebody is slowly torturing me to death.
Right.
And that doesn't necessarily justify me going into a state of a depression.
or of horror.
Or of horror.
But it does justify you saying, I don't like this, I wish it weren't so, what am I going to do about it? Which you won't do if you're horrified. You'll freeze and make yourself worse. So you control largely, not completely, your emotional destiny and your behavioral destiny. And if you change your basic philosophy of life, then you can change it. You have the power to do so, but you normally sit on your rump and don't use that power.
Well, how would you distinguish your approach, say, from Norman Vincent Peale, The Power of Positive Thinking?
Well, that is a good one in a limited way, because it says instead of I can't do well, I can hit the tennis ball better, and it helps you perform better. But underlyingly is still the philosophy, and I have to, and if I don't hit that damn tennis ball well, there's something rotten about me as a tennis player and a person. So we undermine the negative thinking and don't just cover it up, which will help to some degree with positive and often Pollyanna-ish thinking. Day by day, in every way, I'm getting better and better. Coué. But he went out of business because people fell on their face and didn't get better day by day.
Yeah. In effect, I guess what you're saying is things may or may not get better. They may even get worse, but they don't have to get awful.
Right, and one of the techniques in RET is to show you that you can do better, which is positive thinking, but if you don't, you don't, and even at the very worst, and we sometimes implode what you may do or may happen to you at the worst, show you that you don't have to be miserable. My book, which is just coming out now, is called, my new book for the public is called How to Stubbornly Refuse to Make Yourself Miserable About Anything, Yes, Anything.
That's quite a title. Well, you just used a technical term, implode. Why don't we elaborate on that?
Implode means to really get into your feeling or your behavior and do it many times forcefully, vigorously. Feel the worst, feel very upset, and then change it to appropriate negative feelings. We're not against feelings, just against inappropriate self-defeating feelings, such as sorrow and regret and frustration and annoyance, which will drive you back to A, activating events, bad events in your life, to change them. So we want you to feel, we don't want you to have no feeling, indifference, nirvana, desirelessness, or anything like that, but real feeling.
In a sense, it would seem that when people awfulize, when they make things awful, they're using that almost as a screen to keep from getting in touch with their genuine feelings of disappointment.
That's right. They're very genuine feeling. Their good negative feeling would be disappointment. I don't like this. What can I do to change it? How bad, how unfortunate. And they miss that with how awful, how horrible, how terrible. And then again, they get bad results and sit on their rumps again and do nothing instead of forcing themselves to go back to the grind and change what you can change and to accept what you cannot.
It almost sounds like good old-fashioned American philosophy in some way.
Well, Emerson had some of it, and Thoreau and some of the American philosophers, and I got it mainly from the original philosophers and also from their derivatives, from John Dewey, who had a good deal of it, Bertrand Russell, the English philosopher, Karl Popper, the great philosopher of science, and other modern philosophers.
In effect, you're saying if you just live your life more rationally, if you think things through, you'll be saner.
Much saner, but then again, you better force yourself to do what you're afraid of and to feel differently. So again, it's always, RET is always primarily cognitive philosophic, but very much also emotive, dramatic, evocative, and behavioral, active.
And in your work as a therapist, you don't just sit back and calmly philosophize. You try and use philosophical approaches that really get inside of a person to their own inner thoughts and work with them to change those inner thoughts, what they tell themselves.
Right, and we teach them to do it. We have homework, cognitive and behavioral homework, so that they, as homework, can do most of it themselves. That's why our therapy, rational emotive therapy, is an intrinsically briefer therapy than almost all the others. That's the way it usually, not always, is.
But when you're dealing with logic, I mean, you would admit, I know, that most people are irrational much of the time.
Much of the time.
And not only do we feel that we have to be a certain way and that we must do this and that we can't do that, but we also feel bad if we don't. That is, if I'm a little bit upset, then I feel, well, I must not be, so I make it even worse.
Yes, the secondary disturbance is worse than the primary. The primary is I must do well and I'm no good if I don't, or you must love me and you're no good if you don't. But then the secondary one is, my God, I feel anxious, I feel depressed, I feel angry, as I must not, as I should not, as I ought not be. And you get anxious about your anxiety, depressed about your depression, guilty about your anger, and then you really
Then you go into a panic state.
That's right, and then you're not able to really correct the primary thing. So we in RET first get you over your self-downing about your disturbance, then we go back to the original disturbance, show you how you mainly, largely created it, and how you have the power within you to think differently, act differently, and feel differently, and undo it.
And a good deal of the philosophical aspects of this, I suppose, has to do with the labels that a person applies to themselves. I am a horrible person. Or
right. And we quote General Semantics, Alfred Korzybski, a genius, not a therapist, who said, when we overgeneralize, we render ourselves unsane. So we are against overgeneralized thinking, which again is one of the cores of human disturbance.
So you would spend a lot of time, if a person thinks that they are a horrible person, saying, well, maybe you did a horrible thing, but that doesn't mean you're always a horrible person.
Right, and you're never a good person, because if you do a good deed, save a child, for example, from drowning at the risk of your own life, that's a good deed, but 10 minutes later you might kill somebody or steal or lie. So you're a person who does good, valuable, self-helping, and bad, unfortunate, self-defeating things. You are not rateable. We teach people and show them how to not rate themselves as being only what they do, their performances, their deeds, their acts.
And consequently, I suppose, when they're angry at someone else, not to damn another person, no matter what they do.
Right. One of the main derivatives of the must, since you must do well as I think you must, and you haven't done what you must, you are a totally rotten individual, and you deserve, again, to never get any joy on earth and maybe roast in hell for eternity. So we are against damnation of you, of other people, and the universe.
This must involve, in a sense, a unconditional acceptance of whoever might walk into your office, no matter what they may have done in their lives.
Right. We and the late Carl Rogers have unconditional positive regard or acceptance for people, but we also teach them, which I'm afraid Carl did not, how to regard themselves, how to teach themselves to always, under all conditions at all times, no matter how badly they act or who doesn't adore them, to accept themselves just because they're human, just because they're alive, period.
And I guess that aspect of your work is what has caused many people to label you profoundly humanistic.
Oh yes, and I am, and I wrote a book, one of my best books and one of my most popular books, published by McGraw-Hill, is called Humanistic Psychotherapy, the Rational Emotive Approach, which is a little different from some other so-called humanistic approaches.
Mm-hmm. Well, when a person is really all worked up in a state of panic,
right,
as it were, do you find that disputing with them is effective, or when they're in that heightened, aroused state, are there other techniques that are more appropriate at such a time?
Well, we have many emotive, evocative techniques. One of them is accepting them ourselves, which is emotive.
Yeah.
And we have rational emotive imagery, where we get people to imagine the worst and then feel terrible and then work on their feeling. We have my famous shame attacking exercise, because shame is the essence of much disturbance, where we get you and other people and our clients to go out and do something asinine, foolish, ridiculous, and not feel ashamed. Now, don't get in trouble. Don't walk naked in the streets or anything like that. But yell out the stops if you're civilized enough in your city to have a subway, like we're civilized enough in New York, and stop somebody on the street and say, I just got out of the loony bin. What month is it? And not feel ashamed when they look in horror at you and think you're off your rocker, which they think you are, but you're really not. You're being very much saner than they are.
In other words, it's almost the opposite of positive thinking. You have people really confront their greatest fear.
Right.
And then in the middle of the thing that they thought would be the most awful thing that could ever happen to them, they learn that at least it's not totally awful, that there must be something redeeming about it.
Right, and I got this partly because at the age of 19, I was scared witless of public speaking and approaching young females, and I made myself in vivo alive uncomfortably speak in public till I got over my fear, and now you can't keep me away from the public speaking platform, and approach those females, and I approached 100 of them, and I only got one date, and she didn't show up, but I saw cognitively that nothing terrible happened, and I got over my fear of approaching women. So we get people to act against their nutty philosophies.
It's if, in a sense, when a person thinks that things are hopeless, if you can use your approach to show them one tiny little ray of light, that's an improvement for them.
That's right. When you say I can't stand it, you mean I'll die of it, which you won't, or that I can't be happy at all if you reject me or I fail an examination. We show you can be happy at all. You could often be very happy despite the failure, despite the rejection, and therefore nothing is really that hopeless.
Now, one of the techniques that I see in your work, which strikes me is quite interesting and a little unfamiliar to me personally, is the use of sarcasm.
Right. We use humor. We're sarcastic about your ideas if you're upset, because when you're unhumorous, you take things too seriously, and we reduce your ideas to absurdity. But we never laugh at you, only the way you think and act and feel, and we show you how to laugh at yourself and not to take yourself too seriously, which is what emotional disturbance again is.
And you've even written a whole series of little songs that you teach people to sing to sort of sarcastically laugh at their own ideas.
Right, rational, humorous songs to show them that they can look at themselves and what they do and laugh at it and not upset themselves about it, even when they fail.
Now, I suppose the interesting thing about your work as a whole body of work is that in today's day and age, psychotherapy in general is controversial. Scientists question whether any form of therapy works, but there's quite a bit of research that suggests that these approaches that you've developed are effective with specific problems.
We have about 250 studies of our therapy, mainly RET, but also of what is called cognitive therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy, that shows when you get people to basically change their irrational thinking, they become significantly improved. Almost all those 250, about 80% or 90% do. Then we have another 250 studies or so which show that what I call irrational ideas, you must do well, and it's terrible when you don't. When you endorse more of those, you're more disturbed, and the people who are psychologically and psychiatrically disturbed do endorse more of them, so they look like they're valid. These are experiments. They're not clinical studies, which are always prejudiced by the therapist, but these are objective studies.
I mean, some of the reports go rather far in terms of being able, for example, to help a person get rid of a physiological addiction like cocaine or alcohol by working through the cognitive processes that they have.
Yes, cognitive and behaviorally, and we, and especially in the San Francisco area, have Dr. Emmett Belton, who's very good at this, and many of us are, and we have a new book on the rational emotive treatment of alcoholism and substance abuse by myself and some of my collaborators, and we show people that they don't have to get themselves anxious, and when they're anxious, they don't have to run for the bottle or the Coke or the methadone or whatever they use when they're anxious, and that they don't have to put themselves down for being alcoholic or drug addicts. So we show them all those things, and if they change their basic attitude and then push themselves to not take the substances, then they can overcome it and stay overcome.
In other words, you get at the belief system that they must have that it would be awful if they don't continue with their addiction.
That's right, because that's low frustration tolerance. The two main things that upset people are, one, I have to do well and be approved, that I'm no good, but two, things must be easy, and my anxiety or my despair or my depression must not exist, I can't stand it, so I'll cop out by taking the alcohol or the drugs. We show them they can stay with the anxiety, define it as a pain in the neck and not as awful as horrible, and then work using RET to give it up.
Well, when a person's belief system is that they have to have this drug, and they say, well, physiologically it's a disease.
Right.
I know I'm addicted. How do you logically dispute that?
Well, the answer is that some people, alcoholics for example, do have a gene for alcoholism, so they find it most difficult to drink one drink and not finish the bottle. But they don't have to drink even one drink, and when they're anxious or depressed or anything, they can say, too bad, tough, that's the way I am. I don't have to cover it up or drink to feel better. I'm going to get better by facing my pain and then working through it, which again, RET specializes in showing them how to do.
In a sense, it's very much influenced, I think, by the Stoic philosophers, and in terms of showing people how to lump life.
Right. You and the St. Francis philosophy and Reinhold Niebuhr and Alcoholics Anonymous give me the courage to change what I can change, the serenity to accept what I cannot change, and the wisdom to know the difference between the two. That's one of the precepts of RET, which we got mainly from the ancient philosophers.
Well, Dr. Albert Ellis, this has been an exciting half hour here. We've just got a couple of minutes left, and I wonder if there's any final thought you might like to leave our viewers with.
The main thing is to accept responsibility for what you do. You do it. It doesn't do itself. But never to damn yourself or other human beings, no matter how abominable or stupid or incompetent your behavior.
No matter how low you've gone, no matter what you've done in your life, you can respect and accept yourself as a human being.
Right, and in a sense, you can like yourself and dislike what you do, and acknowledge what you do, and again, work to change it. But even if you never change, you are you. You are neither good nor bad. You are a person who does good and bad, self-helping and self-defeating things. Now, how do you stop it and change?
In a sense, there's a paradox in all of this. It's as if you're telling people they have to face the worst, and in facing the worst, there's always a ray of hope. There's always a sense of optimism.
Right, because you face it, because you don't put yourself down for it, because you see that with hard work and practice, thinking, emoting, and behaving, you can change, because almost invariably you can.
Well, Dr. Albert Ellis, it's been a pleasure sharing this half hour with truly one of the giants in the field of psychology. Thank you very much for being with me.
It's good to have been here, Jeff.
And thank you very much for being with us.
Thinking aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Mishlove with Dr. Albert Ellis. For the next hour, we'll be exploring the techniques of rational emotive therapy. Al, in your book, A Guide to Rational Living, which has sold over 1 million copies, you suggest that to some extent people can apply the techniques of rational emotive therapy on themselves in their own life without using a therapist. And maybe we could begin by discussing when you need to get help from a therapist or coach, and when you can just do it to yourself.
Yes, many people can do it themselves, as even Karen Horney once said many years ago, and a few others. But we think in RET, even though I devised it with clients, or what are called patients, we call them clients, that they could apply it themselves, and they could do it by reading and by listening to cassettes. And only a year after I originated rational emotive therapy in 1955 and 1956, I started to write and wrote How to Live with a Neurotic, which is still in print, North Hollywood, Wilshire Books, and consequently I decided that that helped people so much, the reading, that we give pamphlets and books to our clients, and many people, millions of people. A new guide to rational living, the revised version, has sold over 1 million copies over the years. It still sells scores of thousands every year.
Well, and I'm sure the people who are viewing this tape will have a little pamphlet that comes with the tape giving them an address to send away for additional materials and books of this sort. But let's take a typical example. In fact, let me give you a real one for me. I have a little trouble taking weight off.
Right.
Now, if I wanted to apply RET on a problem like that, how might I do it?
Well, you'd start with assuming that you have some 1 or 2 or 3 nutty musts. Cherchez le should, cherchez le must. Look for the should, look for the must. And as you cram the extra food down your craw, not the regular food, what must are you telling yourself?
I must enjoy it. I must have it. I must not deny myself this pleasure.
Right.
Perhaps.
I must have immediate gratification right now, even though it does me in later. Now, we would show you how to use the scientific method, disputing that why must you? Not why is it better that you enjoy yourself right now. Why do you have to and destroy yourself with the extra weight, the high blood pressure, etc. later? Why must you?
Well, of course, I'm sophisticated enough. I know that it's not true that I must.
But I should get what I want. You see, you lightly know, in quotation marks, that you don't have to, but you strongly believe that, God damn it, I have to, I should, I must.
It's as if there's this childish part inside of me that's not as sophisticated as I might think I am.
Right, your strong, irrational beliefs, which you invented as a child, which you've actually gone over thousands, if not millions of times, and you devoutly believe are stronger than your rational belief. I don't need the damn food. I could live without it.
You know, it's like there's no tomorrow.
That's right, right. So we get you to see the must and then fight it in many cognitive thinking and many emotive, dramatic, evocative, forceful ways, because you hold it very forcefully, vehemently, vigorously, and to fight it by acting against it behaviorally, the 3 ways.
I suppose, though, with me and probably with many other sophisticated, intelligent people, the trick here is that we might be a little too compliant. We might say, yes, of course, I know that I mustn't do that, and at that point we stop working on ourselves.
That's right, we use it as a rationalization. Since I know it, in quotation marks, therefore I don't have to use my knowledge, apply my knowledge, and so I'll diet tomorrow, famous last words.
But if I want to apply that knowledge, what would be some appropriate steps?
Well, as I said, the first one is to acknowledge that you have the must, you are making yourself, and incidentally, you might have 2 musts, because first you might be making yourself anxious, depressed. I must do well, I must be loved, I must do well, I must be loved. Then, because you're depressed and anxious, you need immediate diversion, distraction, and the food is not only pleasant, good, but you can actually preoccupy yourself
It's a
with
gratification. It takes one's mind away from that anxiety, which I must not have.
That's right. That's right. You see, low frustration tolerance. I must not be anxious. I must not be anxious. So we would get you to first look at the low frustration tolerance. Why must you have the food? And the answer is, of course, you don't have to. But also go back to your original anxiety, which very, very frequently you do have, and say, why must you do well? Why must you be loved? Why must you get rid of other kinds of discomfort and frustration? And show you there's never a reason for a must. Because if you must do well, you would. The universe would be that way, and obviously it isn't. You see, so we get rid of need, necessity, must, dogma, and get you to say, I'd like to do very well, but I don't have to. Too bad, tough if I don't. Then you'd lose the original anxiety. Then you still might eat for the immediate pleasure, the gratification.
So let me just be very clear that any time I hear myself in my mind or in speaking or hear anybody else use a should or a must, I can be certain that there's an irrational idea there.
Well, not certain. We don't believe in certainty, but almost certain, a high degree of probability. And again, we distinguish between preferably should and unconditionally under all conditions at all times. We preferably should listen to ourselves right now and speak very well and try to make ourselves clear. But we don't have to under all conditions, and we're not worthless or no good if we don't. So watch the should and see whether it is an outstanding dogma, real demand, command, Jehovian command, as we call it in RET, or it's a strong preference, a very strong preference could be very legitimate.
In other words, that you're careful to distinguish between my thought that if I lose weight, I'll be healthier, so I should do it for that reason.
Preferably, right? Put
As
in the
opposed
preferable.
to I have to lose weight or I'm going to be a terrible person.
Right, and no matter what, I have to lose weight, even if I'm thin, and I have to be perfectly thin, anorexia, incidentally, and I have to keep losing weight and kill myself, literally. So you look for the kinds of shoulds, the commands, the oughts, the absolutes, the dogmas, and you rip them up many, many times in different ways, and also sometimes distract yourself temporarily from them. One cognitive method is relaxation, meditation, yoga, entertainment, all of which distract you from the anxiety and distract you from the food, and they'll work temporarily. But we want you to make what we call a profound philosophic change, meaning that you see those much, make them very conscious, because they're slightly or somewhat unconscious at times, just below the surface consciousness, and then fight like hell to dispute them, to give them up.
Now, I think unlike the recommendations of Skinner, the famous behaviorist, you work with negative reinforcement or with punishment as a technique for behavioral change.
Except we call it penalization because punishment includes damnation, and we're against all damning of humans, including yourself. But you're right, I have this famous penalty that I was given by a client many years ago, and that is, if you really don't want to overeat, let us say you want to force yourself in a sense, you make it more penalizing. And one of the things you can do is every time you eat 10 extra calories, burn a $100 bill or give it to a cause that you hate, like the return of Richard Nixon to the White House or something like that. Any cause that you hate, you give it to him and say, I love your cause, here's this contribution. So we have very many other penalties because although children, as B.F. Skinner rightly showed, are reinforceable mainly by pleasures, by rewards, because they'll do anything for M&Ms, they're crazy. Adult offenders, see difficult customers in therapy won't do that. So we use reinforcements very often, but we also sometimes get them to give themselves, we don't give it to them, they give themselves penalties, and that will frequently work very well.
I recall a famous quote of yours, if a client tells you, I just can't do this, you'd say, well, if I cut one of your toes off every time you did it, would you then be able to?
Yeah, and there was a famous, oh, not a famous, but I saw a movie on TV where this guy is working for the Union Army in the Civil War, and they want him to work for the Union, for the other army, the Civil War, the Southern Army, when they capture him, and he won't do it. So the rebel chief shoots off one of his fingers and says, every day I come, there'll be another finger shot off until you work. Well, how long does he think he changed his allegiance? Immediately.
So what you're saying is that any time we tell ourselves, I can't do this, I can't change, I can't reach this or that goal, that again,
as I must,
that there's something irrational there.
Usually because you can't flap your hands and fly, but usually you can change your feelings, especially your disturbed feelings, because in RET we pretty much insist, not dogmatically insist, that you create your disturbances, not your values and goals. You're given them by your culture, and even then you accept those values and goals, but you say, I must achieve those values and goals, and therefore, since it's your must, you can give it up, undo it. So when you say I can't, you mean it's difficult to, but it's not impossible.
For example, controlling anger.
Right. Now, even then, let's take controlling anger. We don't go for controlling anger. We got rid of giving it up, getting rid of it. But you could even, if you wanted, if you're a boss, you have this beautiful job, and you really don't want to get fired, and your boss is highly obnoxious, you could go home and beat your wife instead of your boss, or do some other things and control your anger. But we say, give it up. Anger is the Jehovian command. I am the Lord thy God, and I know you're doing the wrong thing, capital W, capital T, and you should do the right thing, capital R, capital T, and you are no damn good for doing the wrong thing because you must not do what I say you must not do. And if you give that up and say, I know you're doing the wrong thing, because maybe you're right about that, you have the right to be wrong, you're a fallible human, you're allowed to be wrong, too bad, tough that you are, then you'll be sorry and displeased. We don't want you to be unemotional when people do the wrong thing or treat you unjustly, but you can change your anger to displeasure and sorrow and regret.
And yet there are many very influential schools of psychotherapy that say you should get into your anger, express it, have a catharsis.
Right. And in my book, How to Live with and Without Anger, I show that there are 400 experiments, and that book was written several years ago, which show that the more you express your anger in Reichian therapy or primal therapy or any of those other nutty therapies, that the more you do so, the angrier and the more punitive you usually become. The experiments, and these are not clinical cases, experiments tend to show this. So we say, acknowledge your anger, don't deny it. Don't put yourself down for feeling enraged, even if it's against your sacred mother. If you don't like her, you don't like her. If you hate her, you hate her. And then say, I created the anger. She did me in, maybe, but I created the anger. What do I do to give up my demand, my command, that she not be the way she indubitably is, which is very funny, because how could she not be the way she indubitably is? And then you actually get rid of it, but you have to do it 1,000 times before it stays away.
And so this does require a lot of real work.
A lot of reinforcement in the sense of repetition and going over and over and acting. We get you to act unangrily or to face your mother. Suppose you're enraged every time you see her or talk to her on the phone. We get you to in vivo do what you're afraid to face and train yourself, condition yourself to become much less or non-angry as you originally, even as a child, conditioned yourself to make yourself angry.
So it sounds to me as if you're distinguishing between acknowledging my anger, saying I am angry, I feel angry,
Right.
and acting it out and sort of beating up on somebody.
Right, expressing it. Now, sometimes it's better to assert yourself. I'm a pioneer in the assertion training thing. There's a famous book called Your Perfect Right, which shows you how to be assertive but not aggressive. But that was written in 1971. In 1963, in The Intelligent Woman's Guide to Dating and Mating, the first edition, I have a famous chapter called How to Be Assertive Without Being Aggressive. So we teach you how to be assertive, to say I want X or I don't want Y, but not to be combatant, violent, aggressive against other humans.
Well, what do you do when you're in the throes of some kind of an aggressive impulse?
Well, you tell yourself immediately, I'm creating this, and you try. You have to train yourself, as I've trained myself, to say, what am I telling myself? They shouldn't be this way. Well, hell, they should be the way they indubitably are, and get rid of it. Or you could use other intermittent relaxation techniques or other techniques to interrupt. You could take a walk, the famous one of taking a walk, count to 30. You see, there are many things to interrupt it, but the main thing is to interrupt it cognitively, philosophically, so that it rarely comes back. That's the elegant solution in RET.
I love one of your phrases in which when you say, how could they do this to me? You say, well, of course they're talented at it.
That's right. Or how could they be the way they are? Easily. They have no trouble being the abominable way they are.
We must mention that you're really quite renowned in some way for your use of salty language as a way of affecting change.
Right.
And,
because people get used to the conventional thing, and when I get after them, for example, I'll just give you a usual example. A little old lady comes in and says, I feel worthless. And I say, oh, you feel like a shit, don't you? And she says, how did you know? Because that's the language she talks to herself. You see, she'll never tell a friend to use the word in public, but she talks to herself that way. And then as soon as I say that, she's free to say all kinds of things. So it loosens people up, sexually and non-sexually, when you use good English, Anglo-Saxon four-letter words. Now, it doesn't always do that, because some people object strenuously, but if young males, adolescent males, object to my use of language, then it's a good diagnostic sign that they're psychotic.
Are there limits to our ability to analyze ourselves logically, to uncover all of our rational thoughts?
Yes, we are limited, and I have a whole famous chapter in 1962 in Reason and Emotion in Psychotherapy showing the limits of all psychotherapy, including RET, because we naturally easily think straight, and we train ourselves to do it, and we're not geniuses, and even a genius would have trouble always thinking straight. Now, let me give you an example. There are very blatant irrational beliefs which anybody could see and say, well, yes, that's irrational. Under all conditions at all times, I absolutely must be the best tennis player in the world. Even McEnroe can't do that. Nobody can do that. So that's crazy. But because I work so hard at tennis and I'm a nice guy and a scholar, therefore I must succeed at tennis. It's just as crazy. It's a complete non sequitur, and people subtly think that way, and I think it's the human condition to think that way. So you'll never be, and I am not completely rational. That's utopian. That's nutty. And I must be rational. I must be rational. It's also nutty because that upsets you. So there's no way you're going to be completely so unless the human race finally changes genetically.
So in effect, what you're saying is part of the method of rational emotive therapy is to apply rationality whenever you can, and it's very rational to accept that you can't do it all the time.
That's right. You can't and you won't, and you're lucky to do it much of the time or a good deal of the time or most of the time, but you're never going to do it all the time. No human is superhuman, and you'd really have to be superhuman to do it all the time.
Well, if I may, let me throw this back at you a little bit, because as I look at your life as a person who's in my field of psychology, I almost think, my God, this man is superhuman. He's published 600 articles, he's written 50 books, he's seen 20,000 clients, he's trained 1,000 therapists. He's almost perfect. He's been given every honor. He's regarded as perhaps one of the 2 or 3 most influential psychotherapists in the field of psychology, and I'm honestly very honored to be with you. And yet, I'm sure, or I suspect, that you yourself come up against your own fallibility, your own weaknesses, and I wonder if we could talk a little bit about how you deal with it.
Well, what I do is, especially again at my famous Friday night workshops in New York, where I interview people in public, and you know how crazy the public is in New York City, and they come right off the street and volunteer, and I've never seen them before, and I give them sessions of rational emotive therapy right in public and then throw it open to the audience to discuss. I tell the audience not to speak up right now because the walls sort of reverberate and the neighbor will hear them more than us. And then they start speaking up, and I look at them and say, now that means you, and they shut up. But some of them don't. Some of them keep talking or whisper. I'm not talking, my neighbor's talking. I say, you're talking right now, shut up. We want to get on with the workshop. I'm displeased. But then they keep on, and I say, now look, if you keep talking like that, get back in the John and talk to yourself in the goddamn John. Now, I'm angry. I'm not just displeased. I'm damning them, really, and the audience can see it. And I say to myself, oh, hell, I made myself angry. I commanded, they shouldn't do what they're doing, but they should, I say to myself very quickly. And then while I'm still doing the workshop, get over it. But I'm irrational at that point. And incidentally, I think I inherited that tendency from my father, who was brilliant but irascible and quite angry much of the time, while my mother, who was around all the time, was a very nice person, very rarely angry. So I have my own fallibility, my own limitations. I'm very rarely make myself anxious or depressed, practically never, but I'm still prone to the anger.
I would think that in your position you must demand an awful lot of yourself to keep performing and to keep experiencing the same kind of results with clients.
That's right, but I don't like the word demand. I ask a lot of myself, and I watch myself, and I see people from 9:30 in the morning till 11 at night very frequently in the Institute for Rational Emotive Therapy in New York. And then I write in addition and do supervision and go around the world giving talks and workshops, do many things. But I do it because I want to do it but don't have to. And when recently I had a hiatal hernia operation and kept me out of action for a few weeks, too bad, tough, it's not the end of the world. So I prefer, I like in the one life I think I'm going to live to get much in, to do all kinds of things and varied things, but I don't think it's a command or a demand. I think it's a wish, and because I wish rather than command, I don't get anxious, I don't get upset, so therefore I'm more efficient than I would otherwise be.
You know, I'm getting to the point after having listened to a number of your tapes that when I hear that phrase, too bad, tough shit, I think of you right away.
Right, I'm famous for that.
for saying tough shit. Let's talk a little bit more about that state of mind. It's like gritting your teeth and bearing it, but you know that life's going to go on, things will get better, things will get worse.
Well, you'll make them better by saying tough shit while you say, oh, how awful, I can't bear it, the world is going to come to an end. Then you make things worse, and it's tougher shit that way. So I show people it's hard to change because you biologically and sociologically and by your own conditioning and training are the way you are, but it's harder if you don't change. Therefore, you'd better, you don't have to change.
You use the word sometimes DC for difficult customer.
Right.
These are people who are really stuck in their behavior pattern. They're very resistant to therapy. And I should say, starting out, I had a chance to read your book, Exploring Resistance in Therapy. It's one of your newer books. And you point out that many times that this is healthy.
Right. That lots of times when you're difficult, you resist, you rebel against your culture or your family or sometimes even your work. You may do it differently than other people. That's okay. But if you were over-rebellious, then you cut off your nose to spite your face. You don't wear your rubbers because your nutty mother insisted you must wear your rubber. Now you'll never wear your rubber. So rebellion can be sane, rational, efficient, good, goading you to do things differently. But over-rebelliousness is childish rebelliousness, is likely to do you in.
And what are some of the special techniques that you've cultivated for dealing with DCs, difficult customers?
One is what a lot of other psychotherapists don't like, and I'm afraid that they have problems with it. I can be more direct and more active. Now, with lots of people, I'm just calm and serene, just show them the ABCs, that at A, they get something bad that they don't like, and at B, they tell themselves, I can't stand it, it must not be this way, and at C, they get upset, and at D, they dispute. I can do that. But with others, they don't do it, or they do it badly, or they say, I can't do it when they can. So then I say, okay, if you say you can't change your thinking, go be sick. I can show you how to be sicker than you are, because I'm an expert in how people make themselves disturbed, emotionally disturbed. If you want to do that, I'll do that. So I get after them quite strongly, but that doesn't mean everybody. This is just some of the difficult customers who I get after that way.
Well, let's highlight this notion that you mentioned a moment ago about being directive, because clearly there are schools of psychotherapy, the Rogerians and the humanists and the existentialists and the Jungians who suggest that any time a therapist is directive, it's counter-therapeutic. And you're saying just the opposite.
And even some of the cognitive behavior therapy, such as the school of Aaron Beck, implies that you have to go slowly and easily and gain enormous rapport, and you can't be direct because people will resist and then combat you. And to some degree that is correct, so it's not completely incorrect. But I say that there are at least 30% of clients, and often the members of the public, who the more direct you are, the more they respect you, because they know no nonsense about it, no shit, you're going to do what you do, and you're not afraid that they won't love you, and they get it quickly, and why let them suffer and be indirect? So the directness isn't necessary. You can do RET in a Boy Scout, Girl Scout manner, which some of the other cognitive behavioral therapists really do it. But I prefer much of the time, and not all the time, to be quite open, honest, direct, be myself, because that's the way I think I naturally am. And consequently, I think my hypothesis is that that's more effective in a shorter length of time for most people than the indirect namby-pamby Boy Scout, Girl Scout therapy.
And I think in daily life we come across this all the time, and you've written about it in your book, How to Deal with a Neurotic. I mean, if a person is very defensive in the classical Freudian sense, the advice I remember I received as an undergraduate is never tell them they're defensive. They'll just get more defensive.
Right. But I show them that they're defensive, but then I show them what they're telling themselves, what their philosophy to make them defensive. And we have another technique which works beautifully, and that is we unconditionally accept all humans, no matter how obnoxious they are, and if they don't pay their therapy bills to our institute, we still accept them, and show them how to accept themselves. And once they see that they are acceptable, not good people, but that they always can accept themselves with their crummy behavior. They are not crumbs, they just do crummy behavior. Then they realize that their defenses are to protect themselves from damning, blaming themselves. We're getting rid of the damning and blaming. Then they very frequently, spontaneously, easily become undefensive. So the Freudians show them finally they're defensive, but they don't know how to get rid of it.
So if I can summarize what you've just said, it seems that in order to be direct with another person and to do it successfully, there are really two requirements. One is that you really accept them unconditionally, and the other is that you kind of get underneath to the belief systems, to aspects of their behavior that they can change and show them constructively what they can do about their defensiveness.
Right, and the third thing, that you don't need their love and approval, as unfortunately most therapists do need the love and approval of their clients, and they fart around and do very little because of that. Suppose they did the wrong thing and their clients quit them or didn't love them, didn't pay them, that would be awful. So you better add that third thing to the two you rightly said.
Mm-hmm. Well, I should imagine that, having seen some 20,000 clients and trained as many therapists as you have, that it would only be fair to point out you must have seen some things that were terribly disappointing for you.
Very disappointing. Some of the people I've worked hardest with get least better. And some of the people, on the other hand, that I hardly do anything with and read our literature, they hated their mother for 30 years, and I showed them briefly, now look, she should be the way she is, alas, because she is too bad that she has serious problems. And they read my book on anger, how to live with it and without it, and they get over it in 3 sessions or 2 sessions, their hatred. So some things are very good and some things are very disappointing. You never can predict in advance. You can guess, you can't predict how effective you will be, even though you may be acting that you think or I think is effective.
Well, you developed rational emotive therapy some time ago, back in 1956.
55.
And is your alarm going off there, or is that mine?
Oh, it goes off once in a while, and I can't even hear it.
Okay, well,
Great alarm, but I don't hear it on the high notes. These days, I don't hear that much.
All right, I'm not going to bother with it any further then.
No.
But let me go back to this issue, because you developed this therapy movement back in 1955. How has it evolved in your mind? Has it lived up to the hopes that you've had for it? Do you see this as a movement which can ultimately really make an impact on society? Has it changed since the early days?
Well, first of all, it has changed because it was always cognitive, emotive, and behavioral. Now it's added many other techniques, some of which I took from the encounter movement and other movements, which are okay, and from people whose form of therapy I really don't agree with, but some of the things they did are okay. So it has changed and has grown theoretically. It is a much more profound and comprehensive theory than it originally was. It was relatively simple, and now it's more complex and comprehensive. But then the thing that really changed is from 1955 to about 1970, I was persona non grata to the whole psychotherapy movement, except Rudolf Dreikurs, the Adlerian. I got along with him and almost nobody else in the movement. And Carl Rogers hated my guts, though he would never say so. And Fritz Perls was screamed and yelled at the panels that I was on with him that I was boring and too rational. And all kinds of other people screamed against me, and we didn't get very far. The minority are solidly with me. Some of the people still with me from that time. And in 1968, for example, Emmett Belton, that I mentioned before, did a very profound study showing that some of the principles of RET are in all probability true. But then around 1970, 71, 69, Donald Meichenbaum and several other good researchers at universities started showing by experiments, not by clinical studies. There had been a few before that, but they really started showing in droves in the 70s that cognitive and cognitive behavioral therapy, and especially RET, really was on the ball and produced effective results quite quickly and results that lasted longer. And we've had now over 200 experiments which show that. Experiments, not case histories. Thousands of case histories are pure fiction. Freud almost got the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he deserved it because of the fiction he wrote about his case histories. And then another 250 studies showed that my original irrational ideas put in test form really did discriminate between disturbed and less disturbed individuals. So then it became very popular, and now it's really probably the most popular form of therapy used by almost all clinicians, psychotherapists, including the psychoanalysts and the Gestalt therapists, who throw it in without acknowledging it, but they throw it in. So cognitive behavior therapy and RET, there's been a revolution, a cognitive revolution since 1970, and is now exceptionally popular.
Well, you know, as I look at your career, I get the sense that this man is something of a rebel, of a revolutionary yourself by instinct. I mean, here you are in the early 50s telling people to approach sex without guilt, telling people, you know, in radical ways to think of their lives in rational terms, when in fighting against an enormous body of tradition and psychotherapeutic authority. And on top of that, using four-letter words and so-called vulgar language at scientific meetings.
And using them at professional meetings where they're absolutely verboten.
Yeah. So, you know, I can feel that because in my own field, which I know you're not too fond of, parapsychology, there's that same sense of you're up against the establishment, and that's very hard to deal with. You must have had to practice your own principles in order to fight that battle.
Oh yes, without RET used on myself, I might never originate it, but I certainly wouldn't have kept it up because there was so much vituperation against me and so many things for my sex views and my other views that people made up against me, such as I've had 8 wives. I've had a lousy 2 wives, far from 8, and all kinds of other things, and I'm gay and straight. I sleep with all my female clients and all my male clients, which would be pretty good if I was able to manage it, and all kinds of lies about me, but especially against RET, that it's too simplistic, it really doesn't work, people will always fall back. And I said to myself, too bad that these people believe that way, they obviously do, but it's not horrible, it's not awful, it's not terrible. I can take it, and I don't need their approval, so I went on and on and on, and I think only because I went on did it finally start catching, because the whole thing could have presumably been abandoned.
So you had to deal with, then, on the one hand, the disapproval of your colleagues and your peers, and on the other hand, occasional and maybe even frequent dramatic therapeutic failures.
That's right, right, and many failures, because even RET doesn't have all successes. I think it has more proportional and percentage successes than any of the other therapies, but lots of times people either won't use it or I'm incapable of getting them to use it because it's a persuasive therapy, or something else occurs. Tough, too bad, that's the way it is. I can plow on and still enjoy what I do, even though I don't enjoy some of the results.
There's something else as I look at your life. Not only did you say tough shit and plow on, but something kept you from changing your direction. I mean, you could have very rationally said to myself, this is more than I want to deal with.
Right.
You could have become a conventional sex therapist, for all I know, or something a little less pioneering. And I wonder if you can kind of get into that. What kept you focused?
Well, I think that, one, I am a naturally born rebel because I started rebelling against religion and other things at the age of 12. And I was skeptical of much of what I read. I read some of the good rebels like H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell, but I also had it on my own. And two, I'm involved, I'm passionate. To be a rebel, one had better really follow, and I hope not devoutly or fanatically, but really involvedly follow what you want and not get upset by the failures. The great inventors and the great Nobel Prize winners, the thing that differentiates them from others is when they fail, which they often do. As Edison said, genius is 9/10 perspiration or 1/10 inspiration, so you often fail, and Edison failed the film and several other things which people forgot about. Then we don't view it, we view it as a failing, but not us as a failure, and we plow ahead, we're still involved, we still are determined to do better, to change. So I think I have that nature biologically, and then I used RET on myself to help me have it sociologically and conditionally.
Well, you use the term passion and passionate, and I think this is a crucial term, and I know you apply it in your therapy as well. I mean, you're a man who was born in 1913, and if I'm correct, and you are working a very active and full life right now, as you have for many, many years. There's a passion for your work that keeps you going, and many times when you see a client, if I'm correct, that's what's lacking in their life, is this passionate sense of enjoying life even when it's lousy.
They're non-involved, or they're involved in horseshit, and they really devoutly believe and act on that horseshit. But they're non-involved in constructive, self-fulfilling, self-actualizing behaviors and thoughts and feelings, and I think I am, so that modeling, incidentally, is good for them. It's not the only thing, but it's one of the cognitive things, modeling, as Albert Bandura has shown, which helps them, that I am passionate and involved. It's very funny that I once debated with Daniel Casriel, a Scream Away from Happiness. I knew Danny, and he was when he was a psychoanalyst and very prim and proper, and without giving any credit to Wilhelm Reich or anything like that, he started having his people scream and hug each other. But he was he was a good advocate of anger. So I debated on him at the Institute many years ago on anger. And I passionately was against anger, and Danny was namby-pambly and Boy Scoutishly for anger. And it was very amusing. The people in the audience noted it.
Well, you often, when clients experience what is clinically called anhedonia, the lack of the ability to find pleasure in life, you work with them to do anything that would be pleasurable for themselves.
To A, get rid of their nonsense, which interferes, which it often does, but two, to experiment, to try. And in the back of my book, the appendix of my book, A Guide to Personal Happiness, I have a list of about 200 pleasures which people can experiment with and try and see which ones are fitted to them. So I urge, I don't compel, but I encourage people to enjoy, to have a great fucking ball in life. That's one of the main things that they can do.
And this notion of experimenting seems to me to be kind of an important thrust in your work. I mean, you do, in fact, say that man is a natural scientist, that we're always kind of testing and experimenting, and it's this sense of experimentation in a playful way, I think, that colors much of your work.
Yeah, well, I quote a brilliant cognitive therapist, George Kelly, who said that we naturally are scientists because we predict things in advance and then check on our predictions. But he forgot to say we're poor scientists, so I try to get people to be less dogmatic and more experimental and better scientists than they naturally are.
I mean, I get a sense, talking to you now, that if any of your rational emotive therapists were to attempt to work with a client in any kind of an experimental way whatsoever and monitor the feedback and then report honestly to themselves and their client about the results of that process, you wouldn't object.
No, and we do have some people who have done that kind of thing, right.
In fact, there's a lot of creativity in the rational emotive therapy movement, I think, as a result of that freedom to explore that you inculcate by your very example.
And you just reminded me, one of the things we try to get people to do, which they don't do in the served, is be more creative. We creatively go after their or anti-creativity and try to get them to be more challenging, more risk-taking, more creative, and not always, but we often succeed.
But I suppose the nuts and bolts of your work comes right down to the concept of disputing.
Right. And we take each of the major ideas, first the must, why must I do well? There's no reason. It would be nice, but it's not necessary. Two, why is it awful when I don't do as well as I must? It's not awful. It's a pain in the ass. It's inconvenient, and I can still live and enjoy it. Why can't I bear failing? I can. I won't die of it, and I can still go on and lead a happy, though not as happy a life. Why am I no good for failing? I am a person who acted badly, failed, but I am an individual who does thousands, millions of other things, and therefore I am not rateable, only my behavior. And why will I always fail? I won't always fail. It can't prove an always or never. So we rip up all these derivatives of the must as well as the basic must themselves and any other irrationalities which they bring up.
You use the term LFT, low frustration tolerance, for the kind of a person who, even if you tell them tough shit, that's too bad, they say, well, that's awful that it's too bad. It's awful that it's tough shit. They don't want anything negative at all. They can't tolerate that. They're your DCs, your difficult customers, I suppose.
Right. I've done several studies of my own clients and found out that the main reason why they resist, not the only reason, is low frustration tolerance. Now, we're not against taking frustrating things and working against them, saying they're no good, I'm determined to work against them, having some degree of frustration intolerance. But low frustration tolerance means, again, that this frustration must not exist and I can't tolerate it at all and the world's a horrible, rotten place for having it. Screw it, I'm not going to do what I could do to get over it. And we get people to give up that LFT, low frustration tolerance, and to have higher frustration tolerance and then work to get what they want, to stop their procrastinating and to do other things that they could do, perform, achieve, and enjoy doing.
And the basic method of disputing that is successful. It just maybe takes longer with these people.
Yes, with these people, they have such an abysmal low frustration tolerance that they use it at the therapy and say, yeah, the therapists are making me do hard things as you should not, must not. It's too hard. It must not be that hard. How awful that is that hard. So they won't work at the therapy. But we show them, and I don't know whether I originated or AA originated, is no gain without pain. Tough. It's much harder if you don't. Now you better PYA, push your ass to change. You don't have to, but you'd better, because otherwise I can't change you. I can show you how to do it, but I never can do it for you.
Mm-hmm. And you advocate a lot of homework.
Yes.
Unlike some therapies.
Yeah, because the behavioral assignment I gave myself years ago when I was 19 was to force myself uncomfortably to speak in public until I got over my fear of it, and to force myself to pick up women until I got over my fear of doing so. So we always have activity homework assignment, in vivo, alive, as John B. Watson did years ago with little children. Put a rabbit that they feared at one end of the table, a real live rabbit, not a picture of a rabbit, and a child at the other, and gradually got them closer while distracting and the child and feeding the child, and they gave up their fears. These little kids at 5 and 6. And I said, hell, if John B. Watson could do it with little kiddies, I could do it with myself. So I did it, and I always include, just about always, activity, in vivo, alive, homework assignments to do what you're afraid of and stay in uncomfortable conditions till you make yourself comfortable and then enjoying.
Mm-hmm. So you're not at all alarmed when maybe a client comes to see you and you give them this homework and things seem to get worse for them because they're confronting their fear.
No. I want them to acknowledge their fears, to confront them, to feel it, and then to work against it. So we're not alarmed. Now, of course, we may lose a few that way because they don't want to do it, and they may go to other therapists who keep them for 9 or 10 years and pat them on the head, and I think they feel better. But I wrote a famous essay in 1972 saying, to feel better is not to get better. REG tries to help you get better, not merely feel better.
So if a client comes to you and says, this is my problem, X behavior is just awful, I can't bear it, it is horrible, and you say, okay, go out and do exactly that. They go out and do it, and then they come back and say, it was just as awful as I thought.
Well, you forgot that, first of all, you're giving the second thing I get them to do, but while they're doing it, we're always cognitive and behavioral, not just behavioral. We would get them to say, if I do this, and it is very unpleasant, what makes it awful? What do I tell myself, think, cognize, philosophize to make it awful? We get them to see it is not awful, just a pain in the ass. Then they very likely, not by any means completely, will not find it awful, and they may even find it pleasant to do.
Because basically what you're saying is nothing is really awful. That's the point of dispute that you take.
Yes, because we prove that awful, there are catastrophes in the world. If 100 people get killed in a plane accident or on a bridge or something, that's a catastrophe. It means many bad things or much bad things very much happen. But awful means one, very, very bad, which lots of things are, a good many things. A Holocaust is as bad as could be. Two, totally bad. Three, more than bad, 110% bad. And four, badder than it must be. Now, it can't even be totally bad, because years ago I used to think that one thing was totally bad, and I said so, being tortured to death slowly. But then a psychologist in my audience said, no, that's not totally bad. You could always be tortured to death slower. So even that isn't 100%. You can't get up to 100%, but you can't get 110, and you can't get something that's 90% bad and should only be 89. It should be 90 if it's 90. So nothing is awful, horrible, or terrible, though many things are very, very bad, and you better accept that badness and then do your best to change that badness.
What about when a person comes to you and they may say, well, this may not ultimately be very bad, but in my value system it would be unbearable. Other people may be able to bear it, but because of my station in life or the way I was raised, this would be just awful. Particularly upper class people, I should think.
They are what we call tautologically or definitionally disturbed. That means that they're defining badness as awful, and I say you're entitled to do that. You can have any value system you want, but do you want to suffer? With your value system taking something which is highly obnoxious, inconvenient, unpleasant, frustrating, and calling it awful, you will really be off the wall. While if you call it what other people call it, or what it seems to be very, very bad against your interest, that's what bad really means, then you'll be displeased and sorry and determined to change it, or accept it if you cannot. Now, which do you want? Do you want the value system of awfulness, which you're entitled to? And I'll tell you several other nutty value systems that you could have. Do you want to believe in demons, which is really what awful is? It's a demon that you invent. Or do you want to believe in badness, uncomfortableness that you can do something about or accept? And then most of the time, the ones that are not too difficult, accept that it's not awful, but it is very bad. Okay, how do I change it or accept it?
Oh, I would imagine you come up against from time to time clients who have fundamentalist religious views, who believe that things can sometimes be damnably awful.
Right, or damnable.
Yeah.
And I tell them that, look, you're entitled to your view, but let's take a typical case. This boy masturbates, and he's guilty. And he comes to me, and I say, what's wrong with masturbation? And he says, well, it's against the Bible. In the Bible, they say you roast in hell or something like that, in the Koran or the Torah or the Bible. But anyway, I say, well, you're entitled to believe that. If you want to believe that, stop masturbating. Well, he doesn't want that solution to his problem. He wants to be able to masturbate and not be guilty. And the only way he can be is by taking his devout belief in whatever Bible he believes in and making it, ameliorating it to a lesser devout belief, and one that masturbation is bad. He could still believe that, but it's better not to masturbate, or God will accept me as a sinner, and I quote the Bible to him to accept the sinner but not the sin. And in the Christian Bible, you always get grace, no matter what you do. If you believe in Jesus, Jesus is the Son of God and gives you grace. Now, go masturbate and then finally get grace or something like that, or pick a less fundamentalist part. Religion, well, usually they're Protestants, pick another Protestant sect or a less fundamentalist Catholic sect if you're a Catholic or an Orthodox Jew, and that's what they usually do. They pick a less fundamentalist view and give up damnation, but they still are entitled to believe that masturbation is wrong, and they'd better try to avoid it. That's okay.
I like the term that you used, to give yourself grace.
Right, and that's what we really do. Well, many people tell me, you know, you say you're an atheist, but you're really a good Christian because you give yourself, or everybody, and we give everybody in RET, grace. And I say, yes, that's what we believe in. Again, you accept the sinner and even condemn the sin and put people away. Don't let them run around. Don't let Hitler run around when he's sinning. So you condemn the sin, but not the individual. You always give the individual grace, which we call full, complete, unconditional acceptance, whether or not he or she does well, whether or not he or she is loved. We always give grace, and we teach people to give themselves grace with the Christian religion if they want to use that, or they don't need the Christian religion.
But I think that puts you in a very enviable position in a way, because you're able to come to a person and very forthrightly tell them that their behavior is asinine, insane in some ways, and yet you accept them.
That's right. They're not asses. Their behavior is asinine, but there is no such thing as a fool or an ass. That's back to Alfred Korzybski and not overgeneralize. And we accept them, not their behavior, and we confront more than others. People say to me, well, do you like me? And I said, well, frankly, if I met you socially, I would boycott you, to my clients, many of them, not all of them. They say, why? And I say, because your behavior is so crummy. Your behavior stinks, but you're not a stinker. Now, what are you going to do to change that behavior? So I can confront them. I don't need their love again, and I can show them that they act badly, but they aren't bad people.
And I guess it's your ability to accept people so totally that allows you to be so direct.
Right. You see, if I were a condemner, then I couldn't go indirectly. I could, but it probably wouldn't work. But because I am a non-condemner, they get the impression that Ellis really knows what he's talking about. He's authoritative, not authoritarian, which we're quite opposed to, but authoritative. You know, maybe I better listen to him and try some of the things he says.
We've got about 5 minutes left, and I'd like to comment as we wrap up this hour. I noticed in several of your newer books you've used what's called E-prime as a way to write these books, a stylistic way of writing in which you totally eliminate the use of the verb to be, is, are, was, were.
Which I get from general semantics again. It was recommended by Korzybski, but not used by him, but used by a few of his followers who I followed. So we try to teach people to use E-prime, not to say I am a psychologist, because besides doing psychology, I do many other kinds of things. I eat and go to the John and do lots of things besides psychologize, and therefore no label. And Alfred Korzybski and general semantics are particularly against labeling. We teach people not to label themselves, nor to label other humans. And therefore E-prime helps them. You can still do it with E-prime, but it helps you not do it.
Because when you say, he is this, I am that, we're getting away from, I suppose, the process, rather that we make ourselves into things.
Right, and we imply, and will always be. You see, if I am a bad person, the implication is I'll always be. Well, if I do bad things, the implication I don't have to. So that is the is of identity. I am what I do is very bad, as Korzybski and other general semanticists show. So we're opposing that and teaching people not to overgeneralize, which is one of the main essences, again, of human disturbance. To abstract the generalize is good. To overgeneralize disturbs you, and that's why Korzybski's book was called Science and Sanity, and he was not a therapist.
Well, Dr. Albert Ellis, it's been a real pleasure sharing this hour with you. We have a minute left, and I wonder, in closing, if you have a final thought for our viewers.
The main one, again, is cherchez le should, cherchez le must, that upsets you, not they upset you, and realize that you created, and you can always unthink what you think and refuse to believe what you devoutly believe in a masturbatory fashion.
Look for the shoulds and look for the musts.
Right, and give them up.
Dr. Albert Ellis, thank you very much for being with me.
It's great being here, Jeff.
And thank you for being with us.